How ancient Roman roads were built, boring history for sleep. Good evening and welcome. Find yourself a comfortable position. Let the weight of the day settle. We're going on a quiet journey tonight, back through the centuries to a time when the world moved more slowly, when roads were built stone by careful stone, and when patience was measured not in minutes but in seasons. Tonight, we explore how the ancient Romans built their roads. Not the battles they fought or the emperors who ruled, but something far more peaceful. The methodical, repetitive work of laying foundations. The simple act of placing stones in careful patterns. The slow, steady progress of creating paths that would last for thousands of years. There's nothing urgent here. No drama. Just the gentle rhythm of construction, the quiet dedication of workers under open skies, and the enduring legacy of roads that still lie beneath our feet today. So breathe slowly. Let your mind drift back to the Roman world at dawn, when mist hung low over empty landscapes and the first light touched ancient stones that had just been laid the day before. The Roman world at first light. Imagine, if you will, the countryside of ancient Italy just as the sun begins to rise. The air is cool and still. Dew clings to tall grasses that grow along the edges of newly constructed pathways. In the distance, a road stretches across the landscape, its stones pale gray in the early morning light. There are no vehicles rushing past. No sounds of engines or horns. Just the occasional call of a bird settling into the day. Perhaps the distant lowing of oxen waiting patiently in their yokes, ready for another day of slow, measured work. This is the Roman world before the bustle begins. Before merchants load their carts. Before soldiers march in formation. Before the day's heat makes the stones warm to the touch. Right now, in these quiet moments, the roads belong only to the dawn and to the memory of all the hands that built them. The Romans understood something profound about the world. They understood that an empire is not held together by armies alone, but by connections. By the ability to move from one place to another with reliability and purpose. And so they built roads. Not quickly, not carelessly, but with a patience and attention to detail that would become legendary. These roads would eventually span more than 50,000 miles of paved surface, connecting Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the rivers of Mesopotamia. But each mile began the same way. With surveying, with planning, with the slow removal of earth and the careful placement of stone. Why Romans built roads? The Roman Empire was vast, unimaginably vast by the standards of the ancient world. From the fog-shrouded hills of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of North Africa, from the olive groves of Spain to the cedar forests of Syria, Rome claimed dominion over lands that spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived according to different customs. But there was a problem. A problem as old as civilization itself. How do you govern lands you cannot reach? How do you defend borders that are weeks of travel away? How do you collect taxes from provinces that feel like different worlds? The answer, the Romans discovered, was roads. Not simple dirt paths that turned to mud with every rain. Not winding trails that followed the easiest route through hills and valleys. But proper roads. Engineered roads. Roads built with such care and precision that they could be traveled in any season, in any weather, by armies or merchants or government officials carrying important messages. The Romans needed these roads for practical reasons. Military reasons, first and foremost. When a rebellion broke out in a distant province, legions needed to march there quickly. When barbarian tribes threatened the northern frontiers, reinforcements had to arrive before cities fell. Speed meant survival, and speed required roads that armies could trust. The military mindset shaped everything about Roman road construction. Roads were built straight whenever possible, cutting through obstacles rather than going around them. They were built wide enough for soldiers to march 5 abreast, or for 2 carts to pass each other without slowing down. They were built strong enough to support the weight of heavily laden supply wagons, and durable enough to withstand the constant pounding of iron-shod sandals and iron-rimmed wheels. But roads served more than military purposes. They carried messages. In an empire before telegraph or telephone, information moved at the speed of a horse or a running man. Important news, government decrees, tax records, census data, all of these had to physically travel from province to capital. Good roads meant that a message sent from Rome might reach a governor in Gaul within days instead of weeks. Fast communication meant efficient administration. Roads also carried commerce. Grain from Egypt fed the population of Rome. Wine from Gaul satisfied Roman taste for imported luxuries. Olive oil from Spain lit lamps throughout the empire. Pottery, textiles, metalwork, all manner of goods flowed along Roman roads, creating an interconnected economy that enriched cities and tied distant regions together with bonds of mutual benefit. And roads carried something less tangible but equally important. They carried the idea of Rome itself. When a trader from Britain walked a Roman road all the way to Rome, passing through Gaul and over the Alps into Italy, he was traveling through an empire that felt unified by its infrastructure. The milestones were the same. The road construction was the same. The way stations offered similar services. The Latin inscriptions could be read in any province. The roads themselves were a statement. They said, Rome is here. Rome is permanent. Rome has come to stay. The decision to build roads came from the highest levels of Roman government. Consuls, censors, and eventually emperors authorized the construction of major routes. These men understood that roads were investments in the future of the empire. They were expensive, yes. They required enormous amounts of labor and resources. But once built, they would serve Rome for generations. And so the roads were built, methodically, carefully, with the kind of patience that only comes from understanding that you are building something meant to outlast your own lifetime. Choosing the path. Before a single stone could be laid, before the first shovel bit into earth, the Romans had to decide where their road would go. This was not a simple matter. The landscape of the ancient world was wild and varied. Marshes and forests, rivers and mountains, existing settlements and agricultural lands. Each presented its own challenges. The process began with surveyors. These men, called agrimensors, were specialists in the art and science of measuring land. They understood geometry. They knew how to use tools that seem simple to us today but were remarkably effective in skilled hands. And they had the patience to spend weeks or even months planning a route before construction began. The ideal Roman road was straight. Perfectly, almost impossibly straight. This was not merely aesthetic preference. Straight roads were shorter, which saved time and materials. Straight roads were easier to survey and construct. And straight roads had a psychological impact. They demonstrated Roman power over the landscape. They showed that Rome did not negotiate with nature, but commanded it. Of course, perfectly straight roads were not always possible. Sometimes the terrain simply would not allow it. A mountain too steep to cross. A marsh too deep to fill. A river too wide to bridge. In these cases, the surveyors would plan deviations, but they would return to the straight line as soon as possible. The surveyors walked the proposed route on foot, examining the terrain with careful attention. They looked for solid ground that could support a road's weight. They identified sources of building materials, quarries where stone could be cut, areas where gravel could be gathered. They noted water sources, both because workers would need water and because they needed to plan drainage systems to carry water away from the road. They used several tools in their work. The most important was the groma, an ingenious device for establishing right angles and straight lines. Picture a vertical staff, about as tall as a man, topped with a horizontal crosspiece. From each end of the crosspiece hung weighted strings, plumb bobs that hung perfectly vertical when the air was still. By sighting along these strings, a surveyor could project a perfectly straight line across the landscape, marking it with wooden stakes or flags every few hundred feet. The groma was simple but remarkably effective. With it, Roman surveyors could lay out roads that ran straight for miles, maintaining their line with impressive precision. Of course, the tool had its limitations. Wind could set the plumb bob swaying, making accurate sighting impossible. But the Mediterranean climate provided plenty of calm mornings and evenings when the air hung still and the surveyors could work with confidence. For ensuring level ground, they used an instrument called the chorobates. This was essentially a very sophisticated level, a long wooden bench about 20 feet in length, supported by legs at each end. The top surface had a channel carved into it, and when filled with water, this channel revealed whether the bench was sitting level. Plumb lines hung from each end as well, providing a secondary method of checking horizontal alignment. The chorobates allowed surveyors to measure the gradient of slopes with remarkable precision. This was essential for drainage. A road needed to be slightly crowned, higher in the middle than at the edges, so that rainwater would run off to the sides. The slopes along the sides of the road also needed careful calculation. Too steep, and erosion would undermine the road. Too gentle, and water would pool instead of draining away. There was also the desempeda, a simple measuring rod 10 Roman feet in length. Two surveyors working together would lay these rods end to end, leapfrogging them forward to measure distances. It was slow work, but accurate. The Romans were nothing if not patient. Once the surveyors had walked the entire proposed route, checking and rechecking their measurements, marking the line with stakes, they reported back to the officials who had commissioned the road. If the route was approved, construction could begin. But even then, the surveyors' work was not finished. They remained on site throughout the construction process, ensuring that workers stayed true to the planned line, that excavations reached the proper depth, that foundations were laid level. The planning process could take months. In some cases, alternative routes had to be surveyed and compared. Local conditions might force changes to the plan. But the Romans did not rush. They knew that time spent planning saved time during construction, and that a well-planned road would serve the empire for centuries. And so, slowly, methodically, the path was chosen. Stakes marked the line across the landscape, ready to guide the workers who would transform the earth itself into something new, something permanent, something Roman. The workers who built the roads. On a morning much like any other, as the sun rises over the Italian countryside, men gather along the marked route of a new road. They arrive in groups, some walking from nearby villages, others from military camps where legions are stationed between campaigns. They carry tools, shovels and picks, wooden sledges for moving stone, ropes and baskets, the simple but effective equipment of ancient construction. These are the men who will build the road, not in days or weeks, but in months or years, depending on the length and difficulty of the route. They are not a uniform group. Some are soldiers, legionaries who between wars turn their discipline and organization toward construction work. Others are local laborers, hired or conscripted from the surrounding region. Some are slaves, taken in war or born into servitude, their labor a resource the empire uses without hesitation. The soldiers perhaps make up the largest portion of the workforce on military roads. Roman legions were not just fighting forces. They were construction brigades, trained not only in combat but in engineering. A legion on campaign would build a fortified camp every night, digging ditches, raising earthen ramparts, constructing wooden palisades. Building roads was similar work, just on a longer timescale. For soldiers, road construction served multiple purposes. It kept them busy during peacetime, maintaining their physical conditioning and discipline. Idle soldiers could become restless, prone to trouble. But soldiers working on roads remained organized, following orders, maintaining the military routine that defined their lives. They were also learning skills that would serve them in war. Understanding construction meant understanding fortification, and understanding fortification could mean the difference between life and death in battle. The soldiers worked in organized units. Centuries, groups of about 80 men commanded by a centurion, would be assigned specific sections of road. The centurion ensured that work progressed according to plan, that quality remained consistent, that no shortcuts were taken. Roman military discipline applied to construction as it did to combat. The work had to be done right. Local laborers brought different skills to the work. They knew the local terrain, understood seasonal weather patterns, could identify the best quarries and sources of materials. Many had experience in agriculture or local construction, skills that translated well to road building. Some were hired voluntarily, seeing road work as a source of income. Others were conscripted, required by local authorities to contribute labor to the project. The conditions of their work varied. On some projects, particularly those in newly conquered territories or remote frontier regions, conditions could be harsh. Long hours in difficult terrain, far from home, with basic shelter and simple food. But on projects near established towns, workers might return home each evening, their labor organized in regular shifts that allowed for rest and recovery. Slaves, unfortunately, formed a significant portion of the workforce on many projects. The Roman Empire was built in part on slave labor, and road construction was no exception. Slaves performed the most back-breaking work, the heavy lifting and constant digging that wore down the body. They worked under the threat of punishment, their labor extracted without compensation. Yet we should not imagine these work sites as places of constant misery. Work proceeded at a sustainable pace. The Romans understood that exhausted workers were inefficient workers. There were breaks during the day, time to rest and eat. Simple meals were provided. Bread, porridge, perhaps olive oil and wine. Enough to sustain the body through physical labor. The work itself followed a rhythm. Digging, lifting, carrying, placing, over and over, day after day. It was repetitive work, but there was a certain satisfaction in it. The progress was visible. Today's work extended the road a little further. This month's work connected 2 points that had been separate. By season's end, a substantial section would be complete. The workers rose early, starting their labor in the cool hours of morning. In summer, the heat of midday might force a break, work resuming in the cooler late afternoon. In winter, work began later as they waited for the sun to warm the air and ended earlier as daylight faded. They worked in teams. Some excavated the trench. Others transported materials from quarries or rivers. Still others laid the actual layers of the road, fitting stones together with careful attention. There was a hierarchy, with experienced workers directing less skilled ones, engineers overseeing the entire operation, surveyors checking that everything remained true to the planned route. There were no machines. Everything was done with human muscle and simple tools. A large stone that needed to be moved required several men lifting together, coordinating their effort. Heavy loads were placed on wooden sledges and dragged by teams of men, or in some cases by oxen. The work was slow, but it was steady. Injuries happened, of course. A slip while moving a stone. A tool mishandled. The occasional accident was inevitable when so many men worked with heavy materials. But serious injuries seemed to have been relatively rare, perhaps because the pace of work allowed for caution, and because experienced workers taught newcomers how to lift and carry safely. At day's end, tools were collected and stored. The work site was organized, materials sorted for the next day. The workers dispersed, some to nearby camps, others to villages, some to slave quarters. They ate their evening meal, perhaps talked among themselves about the day's progress, and then slept. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. More digging, more stone, more steady progress along the route. This was the human reality of Roman road building. Not glorious or dramatic, but patient and persistent. The work of thousands of individuals whose names we will never know, whose lives were spent in service to an empire that used their labor to connect its far-flung territories. The first step, breaking ground. The actual construction of a Roman road began with destruction. Before anything could be built, the existing landscape had to be removed. Trees cut down. Bushes cleared. The layer of topsoil with its grass and roots dug up and carried away. This was necessary because organic materials decay, and a road built on decaying matter would eventually sink and fail. The workers began at one end of the planned route and worked forward systematically. The surveyor's stakes marked the center line and the edges of the road. The road would be wide, typically 15 to 20 feet across for a major route, though some were even wider. Wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other. Wide enough for soldiers to march 5 abreast with room to spare. The first task was clearing vegetation. Teams of men with axes and saws cut down any trees in the path. Smaller bushes were grubbed out, roots and all. This was heavy work, especially in forested areas, but it was essential. Every plant had to go. Every root had to be removed. Once the surface was clear, the real excavation began. The workers dug a trench along the entire route of the road. This trench needed to reach down to solid subsoil or, ideally, bedrock. The depth varied depending on local conditions. In some places, just a foot or 2. In others, 3 feet or more. The Romans were thorough. They wanted their foundation to rest on something that would not shift or settle. Digging was done with simple tools. Iron spades, wooden shovels, picks for breaking up hard ground. The excavated earth was loaded into baskets or onto wooden planks and carried to the sides of the roadway. Sometimes this earth was used to build up embankments along the road's edges. Other times it was simply piled to the side, creating the ditches that would help with drainage. The work proceeded slowly. On a good day, a team of workers might excavate 100 feet of trench. On difficult terrain, rocky ground or earth heavy with clay, progress might be measured in tens of feet. But the Romans did not measure success in speed. They measured it in quality. The trench had to be right, its depth uniform, its bottom level, before construction could continue. As the excavation progressed, surveyors continuously checked the work. They used their instruments to ensure the trench remained straight, that its depth was consistent, that the bottom was properly graded for drainage. If something was not right, Workers were sent back to correct it. Better to fix an error now than to discover it after tons of stone had been laid on top. In some areas, the challenges were more complex. Marshland, for instance. You cannot simply dig a trench in a marsh. The water and mud would flow right back in. In these cases, Roman engineers developed clever solutions. They would drive wooden pilings deep into the marshy ground, creating a stable foundation. Or they would build raised causeways, essentially artificial roads on embankments that lifted the road surface above the surrounding wetland. Rivers presented another challenge. Roman engineers were masters of bridge building, but bridges were expensive and time-consuming. Whenever possible, roads were routed to ford rivers at shallow crossings. But major rivers required major bridges, and the construction of these was a project unto itself, often taking years and requiring specialized skills. Mountains could not always be avoided. When a road needed to cross a mountain range, the Romans had two options. They could build the road up and over, following the ridgeline and accepting the steep grades. Or they could cut through, excavating a passage through the rock itself. Some of these cuts were remarkable achievements, channels carved through solid stone by men with hand tools, hammers and chisels and wedges, working day after day to remove the mountain piece by piece. But most roads crossed gentler terrain, and for these, the process was straightforward if laborious. Clear the vegetation. Dig the trench. Check the work. Move forward. Day by day, the trench extended further along the route, a neat channel cut through the landscape, waiting to be filled with the carefully layered materials that would transform it into a road. The excavation phase of road construction could take months, particularly on longer routes. It was not exciting work. No one would write poems about men digging trenches. But it was essential work, and the Romans gave it the time and attention it deserved. They understood that everything that came next depended on this foundation being done correctly. And so the workers dug. In the cool of morning and the warmth of afternoon. Through spring rains and summer heat. Steadily, patiently, they removed the earth and prepared the path for what would become one of the ancient world's most enduring accomplishments. Layer by layer, the foundation. Once the trench was dug and approved by the surveyors, the actual construction of the road could begin. This was done in layers, each layer serving a specific purpose, each carefully prepared before the next was added. The Romans called these layers by Latin names, and each one represented a step in transforming empty ground into a structure that could carry heavy loads for centuries. The first layer was called the statumen. This was the foundation, the base upon which everything else would rest. It consisted of large stones, rough and irregular, taken from nearby quarries or gathered from fields. These stones were often quite big, some as large as a man's head or bigger, and they were heavy. Moving them required strength and care. Workers would carry or drag these stones to the trench and place them carefully at the bottom. The stones did not need to fit together perfectly, but they needed to be stable, locked in place by their own weight and the pressure of surrounding stones. The goal was to create a solid, immovable base layer about 8 to 12 inches thick. This work was methodical. Each stone was positioned with attention. Large stones at the bottom provided stability. Smaller stones were used to fill gaps, creating a relatively level surface for the next layer. The workers checked their progress constantly, using their eyes and hands to ensure the foundation was solid. In some areas, particularly where the ground was soft or prone to shifting, the Romans would add a sublayer of smaller rubble or packed earth beneath the statumen. Or they might drive wooden stakes into the ground, creating additional stability. The specific techniques varied based on local conditions, but the principle remained the same. The foundation must be unshakable. Above the statumen came the rudis, the second layer. This consisted of smaller stones, sometimes broken pottery or rubble, mixed with lime mortar or volcanic ash. The Romans had discovered that certain volcanic materials, particularly pozzolana from the region around Mount Vesuvius, could be mixed with lime to create a cement that hardened even underwater. This concrete-like material was revolutionary. The rudis layer was typically about 9 to 12 inches thick. Workers would spread the mixture of stone and mortar across the statumen, then compact it by tamping it down with wooden poles or heavy stones. This created a dense, solid layer that filled all the gaps in the foundation and provided additional strength. The process of mixing and spreading the rudis required skill. The proportions of stone to mortar had to be right. Too much mortar and the layer would be weak and prone to cracking. Too little and the stones would not bind together properly. Experienced workers, men who had built multiple roads, supervised this step carefully. On top of the rudis came the nucleus, the third layer. This was made of smaller stones still, often gravel or crushed rock, again mixed with mortar or cement. The nucleus was smoother than the layers below it, more carefully leveled. It typically measured about 6 to 8 inches thick. The nucleus required even more careful attention to create a level surface. Workers used long wooden planks or stone slabs to check that the surface was flat and properly crowned, slightly higher in the center than at the edges. This crowning was essential for drainage. When rain fell on the finished road, the water needed to flow from the center to the edges, then into the drainage ditches along the sides. Each layer was allowed to settle and harden before the next was added. In the case of mortar-bound layers, this might mean waiting days or even weeks for the cement to fully cure. The Romans were patient. They understood that rushing the process would produce inferior results, and inferior roads would need costly repairs. Throughout this layering process, quality control was constant. Engineers and surveyors walked the length of the work, examining each section, identifying problems, ensuring standards were met. If a section of the rudis was not properly compacted, workers would remove it and do it again. If the nucleus was not level, they would add or remove material until it was correct. The work proceeded at a steady pace. On a typical day, workers might complete 100 feet or so of road, laying all the layers in proper sequence. This meant that a mile of road, slightly more than 5,000 feet, might take 50 days of good working weather. A major road of 100 miles would require years to complete. But the Romans were building for eternity, or at least for as long as their empire would last. They invested the time because they knew these roads would serve Rome for generations. And they were right. Many Roman roads remained in use for centuries after the empire fell. Some still exist today, their foundations as solid as the day they were laid, nearly 2,000 years ago. The construction of these lower layers was not glamorous work. Lifting stone, mixing mortar, spreading gravel, tamping everything down until it was solid and level. Repetitive, physically demanding labor under the open sky. But it was work that connected the empire. Work that enabled trade and communication. Work that, in its own quiet way, was as important as any battle the legions ever fought. The road surface. The final layer of a Roman road was its most visible feature, and in many ways the most important. This was the actual road surface, the part that feet and hooves and wheels would contact directly. The Romans called it the pavimentum or summum dorsum, and they built it with remarkable care. 4 major roads, the surface consisted of large stone blocks, carefully cut and fitted together. These were not just any stones. They were hard, durable materials. Basalt was preferred in areas where volcanic stone was available. In other regions, limestone, granite, or local hard stones were used. The key was that the stone had to be resistant to wear. The stone blocks were polygonal in shape, meaning they had multiple sides rather than being perfectly rectangular. This irregular shape actually provided advantages. The blocks could be fitted together more tightly, almost like pieces of a puzzle, with minimal gaps between them. This tight fitting gave the road surface additional strength and reduced the amount of smaller material needed to fill joints. Cutting these stones was skilled work. Quarrymen would extract large blocks of stone from quarries, then masons would shape them into the proper size, roughly 1 to 2 feet across and several inches thick. Each stone had to be relatively flat on both top and bottom. The top surface might be left slightly rough to provide traction, but not so rough that it would be uncomfortable for feet or damaging to cart wheels. Transporting these stones to the construction site was a major undertaking in itself. A single paving stone might weigh 100 pounds or more. If the quarry was nearby, stones could be carried or dragged to the road. If the quarry was distant, stones might be loaded onto carts or rafts and transported miles to where they were needed. At the construction site, workers carefully placed each stone on the prepared nucleus layer below. The stones were not simply dropped in place. They were positioned with attention, adjusted so they sat level and stable. The goal was to create a surface that was as smooth and flat as possible while maintaining the slight crown for drainage. The spaces between stones were filled with smaller material, often a mixture of sand and lime mortar. This filler served multiple purposes. It locked the stones in place, preventing them from shifting. It filled any irregularities in the stone surfaces, creating a smoother overall surface. And it sealed the road against water infiltration. Creating this final surface was slow work. A team of skilled workers might lay only 50 or 100 square feet of paving in a day. The stones had to be selected for fit, positioned carefully, adjusted and readjusted until they sat properly, then secured with the filler material. Quality could not be rushed. Not all Roman roads received this elaborate stone paving. It was expensive and time-consuming, reserved for the most important routes, major highways connecting key cities. Many roads, particularly in rural areas or frontier regions, were surfaced instead with gravel. These gravel roads were still built on the same carefully layered foundation, but instead of cut stone, the surface consisted of compacted gravel or crushed rock. Gravel roads were faster to build and easier to maintain. If a section became worn or developed potholes, fresh gravel could simply be added and tamped down. They worked well in many environments, providing a solid, well-drained surface for travel. They were not as durable as stone-paved roads, but they served their purpose admirably. Whether paved with stone or surfaced with gravel, the completed road represented a transformation of the landscape. What had been wild ground, forest or field or empty plain, was now a permanent pathway. A ribbon of engineered surface stretching into the distance, straight and solid, ready to carry the traffic of the empire. The road surface had to handle everything Rome demanded of it. Heavy supply wagons loaded with military equipment, merchant carts carrying goods to market, courier riders galloping at full speed, infantry marching in formation, thousands of iron-shod sandals striking the stones in rhythm, pack animals, private travelers, all the varied traffic of a thriving empire. And remarkably, these roads could handle it. The stone surfaces were so hard and so well constructed that they wore down very slowly. Gravel surfaces required more maintenance, needing fresh gravel added periodically, but they too proved durable. Some Roman roads saw continuous use for centuries without major reconstruction. The historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century AD, more than 800 years after some Roman roads were built, marveled at their construction. He wrote that the stones fit together so perfectly that they seemed to have grown together rather than been placed by human hands. The joints were so tight that a knife blade could barely be inserted between stones. This level of craftsmanship did not happen by accident. It required planning, skilled labor, quality materials, and time. The Romans gave road construction all of these. They understood that the investment was worth it, that good roads would repay their cost many times over in the efficiency they enabled. And so the road took shape, layer by layer, stone by stone, until finally a section was complete. The last stone was placed and secured. The work crew moved forward to the next section. Behind them lay a finished road, its surface ready to receive its first travelers, ready to serve Rome for as long as Rome endured. Drainage, the hidden engineering. One of the most important aspects of Roman road construction is also one of the least visible. Drainage, the careful management of water to prevent it from damaging the road structure. The Romans understood something that many later civilizations would have to relearn. Water is the great destroyer of roads. Allow water to accumulate on or beneath a road surface, and eventually the road will fail. Their solution was comprehensive and clever. It began with the road's profile. As we mentioned earlier, Roman roads were crowned, built higher in the center than at the edges. This crown was subtle, often just a few inches over the width of the road, but it was crucial. When rain fell on the road surface, the water would not sit in puddles. Instead, gravity would pull it toward the edges, running off the sides of the road into the ditches beyond. These drainage ditches ran along both sides of the road for its entire length. They were excavated at the same time as the road trench itself, and they served multiple purposes. Most obviously, they collected water runoff from the road surface, carrying it away to natural drainage channels or absorption areas. But they also intercepted groundwater, preventing it from seeping under the road foundation where it could cause settling or frost damage. The ditches were carefully graded to ensure water would flow rather than pool. Roman surveyors planned the gradient of these ditches with the same attention they gave to the road itself. In flat terrain, this could be challenging. Even a very gradual slope, barely perceptible to the eye, was enough to keep water moving. But it had to be consistent. If the ditch had low spots where water would collect, those areas would become stagnant pools, breeding mosquitoes and eventually eroding the ditch walls. In hilly terrain, drainage became more complex. Water running downhill in a ditch could gain significant speed, enough to cause erosion. To manage this, Roman engineers sometimes built small check dams or diversions in the ditches, slowing the water's flow or directing it away from the road at regular intervals. They also armored the ditches with stones in areas where erosion was likely, creating channels that could handle fast-flowing water without washing away. Where roads crossed streams or small rivers, the Romans built culverts. These were essentially underground channels that allowed water to pass under the road without flowing across its surface. The simplest culverts were just stone-lined channels covered with large flat stones. More elaborate ones were built of carefully fitted stone, creating what was essentially a small tunnel for water. Some Roman culverts still function today, nearly 2,000 years after their construction. They remain open and clear, still carrying water under roads that are now paved with modern asphalt but follow the same routes the Romans chose all those centuries ago. In some areas, particularly in volcanic regions, Roman engineers installed sophisticated underground drainage systems. They would lay lines of U-shaped stone troughs beneath the road layers, fitted with flat stone lids. These functioned like modern drain pipes, collecting water that infiltrated the road structure and channeling it away to safe discharge points. The discovery of these buried drainage systems has amazed modern archaeologists. They represent a level of engineering sophistication that many people assume was impossible in the ancient world. But the Romans understood hydraulics. They built aqueducts that carried water for dozens of miles with precise gradients. They constructed public baths with complex plumbing. They knew how water behaved, and they applied that knowledge to road construction. Proper drainage extended the life of a road dramatically. A well-drained road could last for centuries with minimal maintenance. A poorly drained road might fail within decades, as water infiltrated the foundation, weakened the layers, caused settling and cracking. The Romans chose the former, investing the extra effort during construction to create roads that would endure. Maintaining the drainage systems was an ongoing responsibility. Over time, ditches could fill with sediment or become overgrown with vegetation. Culverts might become blocked with debris. Part of road maintenance, which we'll discuss shortly, involved keeping these drainage features clear and functional. The Roman approach to drainage demonstrates something important about their engineering philosophy. They thought about how structures would behave over time. They anticipated problems and designed solutions. They didn't just build for the immediate need, but for the long-term reality of weather and water and the gradual wear of years. This kind of thinking, this attention to details that most people would never notice, was characteristic of Roman engineering at its best. The road surface was impressive and obvious. But the hidden systems, the foundation layers and drainage channels, and all the unseen elements that made the road work, these were equally important. They were the difference between a road that lasted a few decades and one that lasted a millennium. Materials, what Romans built with. The materials that went into Roman roads came from the earth itself. Stone, sand, gravel. The Romans were pragmatic. They used whatever materials were locally available, adapting their techniques to work with what the land provided. But they were also selective. Not just any stone would do. Not just any sand. Quality mattered. Stone was the primary building material. For the foundation layers, almost any local stone would work. Field stone, rubble from demolitions, broken pottery or bricks. The Romans were practical people. If old buildings were demolished, the rubble went into road foundations. If fields were being cleared of stones, those stones found their way to construction sites. Nothing was wasted. But for the upper layers, and especially for the road surface, more careful selection was needed. The stone had to be hard enough to resist wear. It had to be abundant enough to supply miles and miles of construction. And ideally, it should be relatively easy to shape and transport. In volcanic regions like Italy, basalt was the stone of choice. This dark, fine-grained rock is extremely hard and durable. It forms from rapidly cooled lava, and its density makes it nearly impervious to weathering. The Via Appia, Rome's most famous road, was paved with basalt blocks cut from quarries in the volcanic fields south of the city. These blocks were so well made and so carefully fitted that many sections of the Via Appia remain intact today, more than 2,000 years after they were laid. In areas without volcanic stone, the Romans used whatever hard stone was available. Limestone in some regions, granite in others, flint or sandstone where nothing harder could be found. Each stone type had its own properties. Limestone was easier to cut but wore down faster. Granite was extremely durable but difficult to shape. The engineers adapted their techniques to the materials at hand. Gravel was essential for several layers of the road. It had to be clean gravel, free of organic matter that might decay. The Romans often took gravel from riverbeds, where flowing water had already sorted the stones by size and washed away dirt and vegetation. This gravel was then further sorted at the construction site, with larger pieces going into the rudous layer and finer pieces into the nucleus. Sand was another crucial material. Clean sand mixed with lime created the mortar that bound the layers together. But not just any sand would do. Sea sand, though abundant, contained salt that could damage the mortar. River sand was better, though it needed to be washed to remove silt. The best sand came from quarries, where it could be extracted clean and pure. Lime was perhaps the most important binding material. The Romans made lime by burning limestone or chalk in kilns at very high temperatures. This process, called calcination, drove off the carbon dioxide from the calcium carbonate, leaving behind quicklime. When mixed with water, the quicklime would react, heating up and eventually hardening into a strong cement. But the Romans discovered something even better. In the region around Mount Vesuvius, there existed a reddish volcanic ash that the Romans called pozzolana. When mixed with lime, this ash created a cement that was not only stronger than lime alone but had the remarkable property of hardening underwater. This pozzolanic cement became the Romans' secret weapon for building durable structures. The discovery of pozzolana revolutionized Roman construction. Roads built with pozzolanic mortar were more resistant to water damage. Bridges and culverts could be built in rivers without waiting for the dry season. The material was so effective that the Romans transported it to distant provinces, carrying it in ships and wagons to construction sites far from its source. The quantity of materials required for a major road was staggering. A single mile of road, 15 feet wide, might require several thousand tons of stone and gravel. A 100-mile road would need hundreds of thousands of tons. All of this had to be extracted from the earth, transported to the construction site, and carefully placed according to the engineer's plans. Quarrying was hard work. Workers would identify suitable stone outcrops, then cut the stone free using iron wedges and hammers. Sometimes they would heat the stone with fire and then douse it with cold water, causing it to crack along natural fault lines. Once freed, large blocks would be rough-shaped at the quarry to reduce their weight before transport. Transport of materials was organized with military efficiency. If a quarry was near a river, stones could be loaded onto barges and floated downstream. If the route was overland, stones were loaded onto carts pulled by oxen or carried on the backs of pack animals. On some projects, particularly in frontier regions, soldiers themselves carried materials, trudging along supply routes with heavy loads. The Romans also recycled materials whenever possible. Old roads that were being rebuilt provided a ready source of stone. Buildings that had outlived their usefulness were demolished and their materials reused. Military camps that were abandoned left behind stone that could be transported to new construction sites. In an empire constantly building and rebuilding, nothing of value went to waste. The process of preparing materials continued throughout the construction project. Stone cutters worked steadily, shaping blocks for the road surface. Lime burners kept their kilns hot, producing a steady supply of quicklime. Workers sifted gravel, removing pieces that were too large or too small. It was all part of the slow, methodical process of road building. The quality of materials directly affected the longevity of the road. A road built with soft stone or impure mortar might last only a few decades before requiring major repairs. But a road built with the best materials, carefully selected and properly prepared, could last for centuries with only minor maintenance. And that was the Roman goal. They were not building for the immediate present, but for the future. They wanted roads that would serve their grandchildren and their grandchildren's children. They wanted roads that would stand as monuments to Roman engineering long after the emperors who commissioned them were forgotten. In many cases, they succeeded. The materials they chose, the techniques they developed, proved so effective that Roman roads outlasted the empire itself. Long after the legions had withdrawn, long after the empire had fallen, the roads remained. Solid, permanent, a testament to the quality of Roman materials and the skill of Roman builders. Maintaining the roads. Building a road was an enormous investment of time, labor, and resources. But the work did not end when the last stone was placed. Roads required constant maintenance to remain functional. Without regular care, even the best-built road would eventually succumb to the relentless forces of weather, traffic, and time. The Romans understood this. They created an administrative system specifically designed to ensure that roads remained in good repair for as long as possible. This system involved government officials, local communities, private citizens, and even the military, all working together to keep the empire's transportation network functioning. At the highest level, responsibility for major roads rested with officials called curators viarum. These were appointed by the emperor or the Senate to oversee specific roads or networks of roads. The position was prestigious, often held by men of wealth and political influence. Julius Caesar himself served as curator of the Via Appia in 67 BCE, spending his own money liberally on repairs. The curators were responsible for organizing and funding repair work. They inspected their assigned roads regularly, identifying sections that needed attention. They arranged for materials and labor. They ensured that repairs met proper standards. It was an administrative role, but an important one. A curator who let his roads fall into disrepair was failing in his duty to Rome. Actual funding for repairs came from various sources. Sometimes the government treasury paid directly, particularly for military roads where maintenance was seen as essential to national defense. Other times, local taxes were levied to pay for repairs. Tolls collected at bridges or city gates often went toward road maintenance. Wealthy individuals might contribute money as a form of public benefaction, earning prestige and gratitude. In some areas, the responsibility fell on landowners whose property bordered the roads. Roman law required these owners to maintain the section of road that passed their land. In cities, homeowners were responsible for the street in front of their houses. This distributed the burden of maintenance while ensuring that everyone with a stake in the road contributed to its upkeep. Military units stationed near major roads often performed maintenance as part of their regular duties. This served multiple purposes. It kept soldiers occupied and fit during peacetime. It ensured that military roads, essential for the movement of troops, remained in excellent condition. And it provided skilled labor, as Roman soldiers were trained in construction techniques. The type of maintenance required varied depending on the road's condition and the problems it faced. Sometimes it was simple work, filling in small potholes with gravel, clearing drainage ditches of accumulated sediment, cutting back vegetation that had grown too close to the road surface. This routine maintenance could be done by local workers with minimal supervision. More serious repairs required greater effort. If the road surface had been damaged by heavy use, worn stones might need to be replaced. Workers would carefully remove the damaged stones, check the underlying layers for problems, then fit new stones into place. This was skilled work, requiring the same attention to detail as original construction. Recent archaeological discoveries in Pompeii have revealed an innovative Roman maintenance technique. When paving stones became worn or developed gaps, Roman engineers would pour molten iron into and around the damaged areas. The iron, mixed with other materials like crushed pottery and stone, would cool and solidify, creating a hard filler that repaired the road surface. This was much faster and cheaper than repaving entire sections, allowing roads to remain open to traffic while repairs were made. Sometimes more extensive reconstruction was needed. If the foundation had settled or water damage had undermined the road structure, the entire road might need to be rebuilt from the ground up. Milestones recording such work use the Latin phrase, a solo, meaning from the ground. These major reconstructions were expensive and time-consuming, but they extended the road's life by decades or centuries. Drainage maintenance was particularly important. The ditches along the sides of roads had to be kept clear to prevent water from accumulating. Culverts needed to be checked regularly to ensure they remained open. If drainage was neglected, water would infiltrate the road structure, weakening the layers and causing premature failure. In winter, especially in northern provinces, roads faced additional challenges. Frost could crack stones. Ice formation in the foundation layers could cause heaving and settling. In spring, as the ice melted, roads might develop soft spots or washouts. Maintenance crews had to be ready to address these seasonal problems. The Romans kept detailed records of road maintenance. Milestones often included inscriptions recording who had performed repairs and when. This served several purposes. It credited the officials responsible, encouraging others to take pride in maintaining their roads. It provided a historical record that helped future administrators plan their own maintenance schedules. And it reminded travelers that the road they used was being actively cared for by the government. This attention to maintenance was one reason Roman roads lasted so long. Many ancient civilizations built impressive roads, but few maintained them as systematically as Rome. Roads that might have lasted only a few decades with minimal care remained functional for centuries because someone was always watching, always ready to fix problems before they became catastrophic. The system was not perfect. During times of crisis, when government funds were tight or when provinces were disrupted by war, maintenance might be neglected. Roads in less important areas sometimes received less attention than major routes. But overall, the Roman maintenance system worked remarkably well, keeping thousands of miles of roads functional throughout the empire's long history. Even after the Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century, some of the maintenance traditions continued. In the Eastern Roman Empire, roads were maintained into the 6th century. In the former Western provinces, local communities often continued to care for roads simply because they still needed to use them. Today, archaeologists can often identify periods of Roman road maintenance by examining the layers of repair work visible in road cross-sections. Each layer tells a story. A patch of different stone indicating a repair. A layer of gravel showing resurfacing work. The accumulated evidence of centuries of careful attention. This commitment to maintenance reflects something fundamental about Roman culture. They built for permanence. They understood that creating something valuable meant accepting responsibility for preserving it. The roads were not just infrastructure. They were a trust passed from one generation to the next, and each generation's duty was to maintain that trust for those who would follow. Milestones along the way. Every 1,000 paces along a Roman road, a stone column rose from the ground. These were the milestones, the milliaria, markers that transformed an empty roadway into a measured, documented, administered space. They stood at the roadside, weathering quietly through the seasons, their inscribed messages carrying information across time. The Roman mile, from which we get our English word, was based on mil passus, 1,000 paces. Each pace was a double step, the distance covered as a Roman soldier's left foot and then his right foot struck the ground. 5 Roman feet made 1 pace, so 1,000 paces equaled 5,000 Roman feet. This worked out to approximately 1,480 meters, or about 92% of a modern mile. Milestones were typically cylindrical columns, though some were rectangular. They were made from whatever local stone was available: granite, marble, limestone. Each column stood on a square or cubic pedestal, and the total height varied from about 6.5 feet to 13 feet, with a diameter of roughly 20 to 30 inches. They were substantial structures, built to last as long as the roads they marked. The inscriptions carved into these stones carried multiple layers of information. Most prominently, they recorded the distance from the road's starting point, its caput vae. In Italy, all the great roads conceptually originated from Rome itself, specifically from a golden milestone, the Miliarium Aureum, erected by Emperor Augustus in the Forum. This golden column symbolically represented the center of the empire, the point from which all distances were measured. But milestones recorded more than just distance. They typically included the name of the reigning emperor, along with his full titles. This served a propaganda purpose, reminding travelers at every mile that they were moving through territory administered by Rome, traveling on roads built and maintained by imperial authority. The milestone became a physical manifestation of Roman power, planted at regular intervals across the landscape. The inscriptions also often named the official responsible for building or repairing the road. This might be a consul, a provincial governor, or a curator specifically appointed to oversee the road's construction. If the stone marked a repair rather than original construction, it would include Latin terms like refacit, meaning repaired, or restitut, meaning restored. The phrase a solo indicated a complete reconstruction from the ground up. For travelers, these milestones provided essential navigation information. In an age before maps were common or accurate, knowing exactly where you were on a journey was valuable. A traveler could count the milestones to know how far they had come and estimate how much further they had to go. The consistency of the markers provided reassurance. If you were seeing milestones, you were on a proper Roman road, not some lesser local track. The milestones also served to regulate the cursus publicus, Rome's imperial courier and transportation service. This system, established by Augustus, operated stations at regular intervals along major roads. These stations, called mutations and mansions, provided fresh horses for couriers and accommodation for official travelers. The milestones helped ensure that these stations were properly spaced, making the system efficient and predictable. In provinces like Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, milestones often carried bilingual inscriptions, Latin on one side and Greek on the other. This acknowledged the multilingual reality of the Eastern Empire while maintaining Latin as the language of imperial administration. These bilingual stones have proven particularly valuable to modern archaeologists and historians, helping to decipher damaged or unclear Latin texts by comparison with their Greek equivalents. Not all milestones recorded distances. Some, particularly those erected in later periods of the empire, focused almost entirely on imperial titles and propaganda. By the 4th century, milestones had largely ceased to function as practical distance markers and had become primarily political monuments, asserting imperial presence and authority. The physical work of erecting milestones was part of road construction. The columns had to be quarried, transported, carved with their inscriptions, and set in place. Each milestone represented a significant investment of labor and skill. Stone carvers would spend days carefully cutting the Latin letters deep into the stone, ensuring they would remain legible for centuries. The positioning of milestones was carefully planned. They needed to be visible from the road but not obstruct traffic. They were placed at the roadside, usually on the right side as you traveled away from Rome or the major city that served as the road's starting point. On important roads, the milestone spacing was remarkably consistent, testament to the Roman skill at measuring distance accurately. Over time, milestones became reference points for other purposes. Inns and way stations were often located near milestones, both because the markers indicated distances traveled and because innkeepers believed they brought good fortune. Property descriptions might reference nearby milestones. 7 miles and 5 furlongs from Rome was a perfectly valid address in the Roman world. Many Roman milestones have survived to the present day. More than 100 remain in Britain alone, most in remote rural locations. They stand weathered and worn, their inscriptions faint but often still readable. They have been moved from their original positions in many cases, taken to museums or displaced by modern road construction, but they endure. Archaeologists and historians have used milestones to reconstruct Roman roads that no longer exist. By mapping the locations where milestones have been found and reading their distance inscriptions, scholars can determine where roads once ran and how they connected different cities. In some cases, milestones are the only remaining evidence of roads whose physical remains have been completely erased by centuries of agriculture or development. The milestone tradition did not end with Rome. Medieval and early modern European roads continued to use distance markers, though the practice had largely lapsed during the chaos that followed the empire's fall. In Britain, systematic milestone placement was not legally required until 1698, more than 1,200 years after the Romans had left. Today, modern highway markers are direct descendants of Roman milestones. The concept is identical, regular markers providing distance information to travelers. The materials have changed. Concrete and metal instead of stone. The inscriptions are simpler, just numbers indicating distance. But the fundamental purpose remains the same. We still need to know where we are on our journey. We still find comfort in the regular appearance of markers telling us how far we have come. When you see a mile marker on a modern highway, you are looking at an idea that is more than 2,000 years old, an idea that was perfected by Roman engineers who understood that managing an empire meant not just building roads but making those roads comprehensible, navigable, and measured. The milestones made the Roman road network legible, transforming raw distance into organized, knowable space. Life along the roads. The roads did not exist in isolation. They created their own ecosystem of human activity. Along every major route, a whole support infrastructure developed to serve the needs of travelers. Inns, stables, supply stations, workshops. Small settlements grew up at convenient stopping points. The roads connected cities, but they also created new communities in the spaces between. The most important facilities were the official stations of the cursus publicus. This imperial courier and transportation service operated a network of stations along all major roads. The stations came in 2 types. Mutations were simple changing stations where couriers could get fresh horses. They were spaced about 10 to 15 miles apart, roughly a 2 to 3 hour ride at courier speeds. Mansions were larger establishments that provided overnight accommodation as well as horses. These appeared every 25 to 30 miles, a full day's journey. The cursus publicus was strictly for official use. Imperial couriers carrying government dispatches. Military officers traveling on orders. Provincial governors and other high officials on state business. To use the system, a traveler needed a diploma, an official pass issued by the emperor or high-ranking officials. Without this authorization, the stations would not provide service. The efficiency of this system was remarkable. A courier with authorization and a series of fresh horses could cover more than 100 miles in a day, carrying messages from the emperor to distant provinces with remarkable speed. In emergencies, couriers reportedly traveled even faster, though at great cost to both horses and riders. For ordinary travelers, those without official authorization, a parallel system of private accommodations developed. These were the taberni and kaupones, inns and taverns that catered to merchants, pilgrims, and anyone else traveling the roads. The quality of these establishments varied enormously. Some were comfortable and well-run. Others were notorious for their poor food, uncomfortable beds, and disreputable clientele. Roman literature is full of complaints about roadside inns. Dirty rooms. Beds infested with fleas. Wine watered down to the point of being unrecognizable. Innkeepers who cheated travelers on prices. Some of this was likely exaggerated for comic effect, the kind of stereotypical griping that travelers have always engaged in. But poor quality inns were common enough that traveling with servants who could prepare food and arrange camping was preferable for those who could afford it. The better inns provided substantial services. Stabling for horses and pack animals. Meals prepared in kitchens that operated day and night. Common rooms where travelers could gather, share news, and trade information about road conditions ahead. Some larger establishments had baths, allowing travelers to wash away the dust and sweat of the road. In locations were strategic. They clustered at crossroads where multiple routes converged. They appeared near river crossings, especially where bridges or ferries charged tolls and travelers needed to pause. They grew up near the boundaries of different administrative regions, where tax collection points created natural stopping places. And they appeared at regular intervals along major routes, providing accommodation at distances that matched typical daily travel times. The inns themselves generated secondary economic activity. Blacksmiths set up shop near inns to repair broken cartwheels and shoe horses. Merchants established markets where travelers could purchase supplies. Local farmers found ready customers for their produce. A successful inn could transform an empty crossroads into a thriving village. Food for travelers came from multiple sources. Some was local, purchased from nearby farms or markets. Some was imported along the roads themselves, as merchants specialized in supplying the inns. Grain for bread, the staple of the Roman diet. Wine, which was safer to drink than water of uncertain quality. Olive oil for cooking and lighting. Preserved meats and fish. Dried fruits. The menu at a roadside inn reflected both local availability and the broader trade networks that the roads enabled. Along less traveled roads or in remote areas, services might be minimal. A farmer might offer basic accommodation in a barn. A village might have a single tavern serving simple food. Travelers in these areas often carried their own supplies, stopping only for water and rest. Dangers existed on the roads as well. Bandits haunted some routes, particularly mountain passes or forested stretches where ambush was easy. Lone travelers were vulnerable. The wealthy traveled with guards or joined groups for safety. Roman law punished banditry severely, but remote areas were difficult to police. Weather posed another challenge. Summer heat could be oppressive, making midday travel exhausting. Winter cold, especially in northern provinces, could be dangerous. Rain turned unsurfaced side roads into mud. Flooding could make rivers impassable. Smart travelers plan their journeys around seasons, avoiding winter travel when possible and arranging their daily schedule to rest during the worst heat. The pace of travel was determined by the mode of transportation. A person walking might cover 15 to 20 miles in a day of steady travel. A loaded cart pulled by oxen moved much slower, perhaps 10 miles on a good day. A rider on horseback could cover 30 to 40 miles if the road was good and fresh horses available. Military units marching moved at about 15 miles per day, but could maintain that pace day after day with military discipline. The roads also carried information in the form of travelers' tales. News from distant provinces, reports of wars or political changes, gossip about the emperor, stories of strange sights seen in foreign lands. These oral networks moved more slowly than official couriers but reached more people. A merchant who had traveled to Egypt might spend an evening at an inn telling stories of pyramids and Nile floods to fascinated listeners who would never travel so far themselves. Markets appeared regularly along major roads, particularly where routes intersected. These might be weekly markets where local farmers sold produce, or larger fairs held annually where merchants from distant regions gathered to trade. The roads enabled this commerce, connecting producers and consumers across vast distances. Religious sites also drew travelers. Pilgrims visiting temples or shrines would walk for days along Roman roads. These religious travelers generated their own economy, supporting inns and merchants who catered to pilgrims. Some shrines became major pilgrimage destinations, attracting visitors from across the empire. The roads themselves became social spaces. Travelers would encounter each other, exchange greetings, share information about conditions ahead. Merchants might join together for safety and company. Families on the move would travel in groups. The roads were not just physical connections between places. They were places in themselves, inhabited spaces where Roman society mixed and interacted. Life along the roads continued day and night. Even in darkness, some traffic moved. Couriers on urgent business. Merchants trying to avoid the worst heat. Military units on forced marches. The major roads never entirely slept. There was always someone moving, always a reason to travel. And through all of this, the roads endured. They absorbed the constant traffic, the pounding of thousands of feet and hooves and wheels. They weathered storms and seasons. They required maintenance, yes, but they did not fail. They remained solid and reliable, the foundation upon which all this human activity depended. The legacy of Roman roads. The Western Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. The legions withdrew. The emperors ceased to reign. The administrative machinery that had governed the empire for centuries collapsed. But the roads remained. They remained because they were useful, because people still needed to travel from one place to another, because the routes the Romans had chosen, the careful surveying that had selected the straightest, most efficient paths, were as valid in the 6th century as they had been in the 1st. The stone and gravel and careful layering did not cease to function just because the empire that built them had fallen. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's collapse, the roads suffered from neglect. The systematic maintenance system broke down. No curators to organize repairs. No government treasury to fund work. No milestones recording the latest repairs. The drainage ditches filled with sediment. The paving stones wore down. In some areas, particularly those that saw frequent warfare, roads were damaged and not repaired. But many roads continued to be used and even maintained by local communities. The major routes remained open because trades still followed them. Pilgrims still walked them to visit Christian holy sites. Whatever local authority existed, whether bishops or emerging feudal lords, recognized the value of functional roads and did what they could to keep them passable. In some regions, the Roman roads became the foundations for medieval roads. New surfaces were laid on top of old Roman foundations. The route remained the same, but the upper layers were rebuilt according to medieval techniques and needs. Archaeological excavations often reveal these layers: Roman construction at the bottom, medieval repairs above, modern road surface on top. In Britain, many modern roads follow Roman routes precisely. The A1, one of Britain's primary highways, follows the route of the Roman road that the Anglo-Saxons called Ermine Street. The A2 follows Watling Street, the Roman road from London to the Channel coast. When you drive these roads today, you are traveling routes that Roman surveyors laid out nearly 2,000 years ago. The same pattern appears across Europe. In France, the Route National 7 follows Roman roads for much of its length. In Spain, many modern highways overlay Roman routes. In Italy, the Via Appia, though no longer the main route south from Rome, still exists and portions are still paved with original Roman basalt blocks. The straightness of Roman roads influenced medieval and modern route planning. When engineers in later centuries planned new roads, they often looked at Roman roads as models. The Roman principle that straight roads were more efficient was rediscovered and reapplied. The Roman understanding of drainage and foundation building informed later engineering practice. During the Renaissance, as interest in classical civilization revived, Roman roads were studied and admired. Engineers examined Roman techniques and adapted them to contemporary needs. The systematic approach to road building, the attention to foundation and drainage, became part of European engineering tradition. The Industrial Revolution brought new road-building techniques, including the macadam process developed by John Macadam in the early 19th century. This method used crushed stone bound with tar, different from Roman techniques but similar in principle. Both systems relied on carefully graded layers of stone to create a durable surface. Today, modern road engineering has advanced far beyond Roman capabilities. We have powered machinery, chemical additives that improve asphalt, precise understanding of load stresses and material properties. But the fundamental principles remain surprisingly similar. A road still needs a solid foundation. Water still needs to be managed. Materials still need to be carefully selected and properly prepared. Some Roman innovations have direct modern equivalents. The crown surface that sheds water to the sides. Drainage systems to prevent water infiltration. Multiple layers serving different structural purposes. These are all standard features of modern roads, invented by the Romans more than 2,000 years ago. The influence extends beyond physical construction. The Roman concept of a road network, of interconnected routes planned as a system rather than as isolated paths, became the model for national road systems worldwide. The idea that government should build and maintain roads for public benefit, rather than leaving them to private initiative, is a Roman inheritance. The milestone tradition continues in modern highway markers. Every mile or kilometer, a sign tells you where you are, exactly as Roman milestones did. The information is simpler now, but the purpose is identical. Distance needs to be measured. Travelers need to know their location. Some things do not change. Archaeological study of Roman roads continues to reveal new information. Ground-penetrating radar allows researchers to map road foundations without excavation. Chemical analysis of mortar samples reveals recipes and sources of materials. Comparative study of roads across the empire shows how Roman engineers adapted techniques to local conditions. Many Roman roads have been protected as archaeological sites. Portions of the Via Appia near Rome are preserved and maintained as historical monuments. Tourists can walk on stones that Roman soldiers marched across, that merchants' carts rolled over, that pilgrims trod on their way to holy sites. The experience connects us directly to the ancient world. The durability of Roman roads continues to amaze engineers. Modern roads, built with powered machinery and advanced materials, often need major repairs within decades. Roman roads, built by hand with simple materials, have survived for millennia. This is not because Roman materials were superior. Modern concrete is actually stronger. It is because the Romans understood systems. They built roads as complete structures where every element supported every other element. The roads also left less tangible legacies. They spread Roman culture. Latin inscriptions on milestones taught the alphabet to illiterate populations. The movement of soldiers, merchants, and officials mixed different peoples and ideas. The roads carried Christianity from Palestine across Europe. They carried trade goods that made distant luxuries available in provincial towns. They carried the concept of Rome itself, the idea of a unified world governed by law and connected by infrastructure. Today, when we complain about potholes or traffic, we might think of the Romans. They faced the same problems. They solved them with remarkable success, using only hand tools and patient labor. The roads they built were not perfect, but they were extraordinarily effective. They served their purpose for centuries, and in many cases, they still serve it today. The Roman road network, at its height, comprised more than 50,000 miles of paved roads plus countless miles of secondary routes. It connected Britain to Mesopotamia, Spain to Egypt. It made the Mediterranean world smaller and more interconnected than it had ever been before. It was one of history's great engineering achievements. And it endures, not just in the physical remains of ancient roads, but in the principles they demonstrated, in the understanding that infrastructure matters, that connecting people and places has value, that building for permanence, building with care and skill and patience, creates something that outlasts its creators. When you drive on a modern highway, when you check a mile marker or plan a trip using a road map, you are experiencing the distant echo of Roman engineering. The roads they built may be gone or buried, but the ideas they embodied continue. The careful planning, the attention to detail, the understanding that a road is more than just a surface, it is a system. That is the true legacy of Roman roads. Not the stones themselves, though many still exist, but the knowledge that such things can be built. That human ingenuity and organized effort can transform landscapes and connect civilizations. That engineering, done right, creates value that persists across centuries. The Romans built roads to move armies and collect taxes. But they created something more lasting than empire. They created a model of infrastructure that we still follow today. They showed that the patient work of surveying and excavating, of laying stone and managing drainage, of maintaining what has been built, is work that matters. Work that endures. Work that connects one generation to the next across the gulf of centuries. A quiet ending. And so our journey ends where it began, with roads stretching across the landscape, empty in the early morning light. Stones placed 2,000 years ago still bearing the weight of whatever passes over them. The Romans who built these roads are long gone. The empire they served has faded into history. The reasons they built, military necessity, and imperial administration have been replaced by other needs. But the roads remain as solid and permanent as human handiwork can be. They remain as monuments to patience, to the slow, methodical work of moving earth and placing stone, to the understanding that some things cannot be rushed, should not be rushed, because quality requires time. They remain as monuments to planning, to the surveyors who walked the land with their instruments, choosing the best routes, to the engineers who calculated depths and gradients, to the administrators who organized labor and materials across years of construction. They remain as monuments to craft, to the workers who cut stone and mixed mortar, who fitted blocks together with precision, who checked and rechecked to ensure everything was level and solid, who took pride in work that would last. And they remain as monuments to vision, to leaders who understood that connecting distant places had value beyond the immediate practical benefits, that roads were investments in the future, that what they built would serve not just their generation but generations yet to come. The history continues quietly beneath our feet. Modern roads follow ancient routes. Foundations laid in Roman times still support the weight of contemporary traffic. The decision a Roman surveyor made about where to cross a river still shapes how we travel 2 millennia later. This is the quiet power of infrastructure. It does not seek attention. It simply functions, day after day, year after year, enabling all the other activities of civilization. We rarely think about the roads we travel. We simply use them, trusting they will be there when we need them. The Romans understood this. They built roads not for glory, though glory came. They built roads because roads were necessary, because an empire requires connections, because people need to move from place to place, because the work, though unglamorous, was important. Tonight, somewhere, ancient Roman stones still lie beneath modern pavement, still bearing weight, still performing their function after 2,000 years. The workers who placed those stones could never have imagined how long their work would last. They were building for Rome, but they built something more universal, something that transcended the empire they served. They built permanence in an impermanent world. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine those ancient workers. The sound of stone on stone, the scrape of shovels in earth, the quiet voices of men coordinating their effort. Not dramatic, not exciting, just steady, patient work that connected the world. And perhaps you can appreciate that some of the most important achievements in human history are the quiet ones. The ones that don't inspire epic poems or dramatic paintings. The ones that simply work, day after day, year after year, century after century. The Roman roads worked. They still work, many of them after 2,000 years. That is their triumph. Not speed of construction, not beauty of design, but simple, enduring functionality. So rest easy. The work of building and maintaining civilization continues. Roads are still built, still connecting people and places. The principles learned in Roman times still guide engineers today. The patient work goes on. And in the morning, when you wake and perhaps drive to work or walk to the store, you will travel on roads that owe their existence, at least in concept, to those Roman engineers and workers who understood something fundamental. That connecting point A to point B matters. That doing it well matters even more. And that taking the time to do it right creates value that outlasts empires. The roads stretch on into the distance. Ancient stones beneath modern surfaces. Quiet, permanent, waiting patiently for whatever tomorrow brings. Sleep well. If you enjoyed this journey through history, Please consider subscribing to Dreamy Hours for more peaceful explorations of the past. Hit that like button if this helped you drift off to sleep. And leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from and what other topics from boring history you'd like us to explore. Until next time, rest peacefully, knowing that history continues quietly beneath our feet. Good night.